Thank you to the Panton family, to the Alex Panton Foundation Board of Directors for allowing me to speak today about something that I think is very important and interesting and something that I'm very passionate about. In any civil society, the goal is to provide a space for people to live their best lives, to thrive, to learn, to contribute, to engage, to be part of everything that that society has to offer. And it really is it's a pathway. I like the analogy of the road, and we are sort of on this. What I'm going to talk about today is kind of this one piece of the journey, which is infant mental health. And we'll talk a lot more about what that means, because there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. We'll talk about what the science of infant mental health tells us about mental health prevention and good mental health, and developing capacities in young children like those that Dr. Edwards spoke about, so that we have children who are robust and able to cope when life gets difficult. And if we want to have resilient children, thriving adolescents who can steady that boat, the governor's analogy so powerful and poignant today, we have to start at the very, very earliest of years. So when I talk about infant mental health, people go, "What are you talking about, Shannon? Babies don't get depressed." And infant mental health really is less about the baby itself and more about the relationship that the baby has with its parents and the relationship that the parents have with its community and the connections that wrap around that baby. It is a multidisciplinary science born out of early theories of attachment and child development, psychiatry, pediatrics, child development, psychiatry. It started originally in 1980 as the World Association of Infant Psychiatry, this recognition that there were oftentimes early signs of severe pervasive mental illness in infancy and young children, and wanting to get better at identifying what those were, being able to then intervene and prevent at a much earlier stage. In 1985, I think the group of psychiatrists that originally started this field of study recognized that this was far too complex for any one discipline to know it all. And so they recognized that they needed to bring in allied professionals, that we needed to have those who were early childhood experts, we needed to have people in medicine, we needed to widen this scope. And I think that, to me, that's the thing that I love about the field of infant mental health, is that it's incredibly inclusive. It doesn't say we know everything, it says we need everybody around the table. And I think it's also what I love about this event, is it is everybody in one place talking about how everybody's individual role makes a difference. Yeah, you can clap that. That's good. And the organization now that sort of is the umbrella of this field of study is the World Association for Infant Mental Health, which is WAIMS. There's currently no regional Caribbean association, so that's something for those of us to work on. So infant mental health really speaks to a set of practices or experiences or conditions that are required between birth to 6 to ensure that that young child has the most sturdy of foundation in which to develop the social, emotional, cognitive capacities that they will need to grow into resilient children, to thrive in adolescence, and to become productive and participatory members of society. The field of mental health, and I put this slide in here because I know that there's so many young people, and I know the Minister of Health spoke about the training program for assistant nursing psychiatry, but I also would implore anybody who's interested in the field of infant mental health to see me, because there are so many ways to enter this field and to become more knowledgeable in it. There's expertise in infant and child development, so I'm glad to see some of the Early Childhood Association people here, to see those that work in early childhood care. There's a whole field that really does look at the psychopathology in infancy and toddlerhoods. Again, those early red flags that we are now able to identify as early signs of adult mental illness in very young children. We have the intervention piece, both preventative interventions and therapeutic interventions. So those things, those early interventions that we know make a difference and can prevent the onset of difficulties, and also then the therapeutic interventions. What are the things that help when things have gone wrong? Professional education, parent and caregiver education, that's kind of what I'm doing here today, making sure that our community understands the importance of this field. The infant mental health field is heavily attuned to cultural and biological influences. Caregiving and parenting is so incredibly culturally contextual, and we can't talk about infant mental health without understanding the context in which it exists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what are the goals of this field of study? There's kind of 4 primary goals, and I've got a video that follows that sort of, I think, captures it all really, really nicely. The first one is to build healthy brain architecture. And we'll talk quite a bit about that in the rest of my presentation. So what does that mean to build healthy brains? What does it mean to grow a brain? What does brain architecture mean? We'll talk about that. And the field of infant mental health spends a lot of time focused on this. We want to make sure that young children have access to responsive relationships. So what does that mean? What does that look like? How do we make sure that we, as the adults, as the caregivers to young children, know how to be responsive, know how to be engaged in that attuned relationship? How, as a society, do we reduce and buffer stress? We can't prevent stress. We can't prevent hardship. We can't prevent all adversity. So how do we buffer young children from it? And how do we develop their executive functions? Again, referencing to Dr. Edwards' presentation about the ability to regulate their emotions, to engage in healthy social relationships, to learn effectively and efficiently in their classroom environments. This is the work of infant mental health.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
And that video is from the Alberta Family Wellness Centre, which is an incredible nonprofit organization. So if you're interested in accessing more of their literature, I would encourage you to do so. So the general understanding, what we now know through the field of neuroscience and infant mental health, is that brain architecture isn't just something that we're born with. It's actually something that is built over time, and in particular, in those very, very early years of life. If you were here last year, you would have learned a little bit about epigenetics, if you remember that, which is the interplay or the interconnection between our biology or our genetics and our experiences and the experiences of those whose genes have been passed on to us. And what we know is amazing is that the human brain is very much what we call a social organ. It is not an organ that when we're born is fully developed. All of the structures are present at birth, but the experiences lay the blueprint for how that brain will function and how capacities will develop in early childhood. And I love this image because this kind of takes what the cartoon that we just watched and really puts it into kind of the realness of it. This is an MRI scan of a developing brain from 107 days to 329 days, so about 3 months to about 10 months. And what you'll notice is that when babies are born, they have all of those structures of the brain. All of the parts are there, but what is missing is the connectivity, the connection that allows somebody to think, to organize, to feel an emotion, to regulate a behavior, to plan, to learn. All of those things are the connection that needs to be developed and built within their brain, and the way that that happens is through connections with their caregivers. Another little tidbit of brain facts. A piece of brain tissue the size of a grain of sand holds 100 billion synapses. And the spinal cord, which is a core part of the central nervous system, which carries the messages from the brain to our body, stops growing at age 4. So 0 to 5, 0 to 6 is this incredibly critical period of brain development that we can't ignore and we need to better understand. I talk a lot about the growing brain, and the brain actually grows. The human brain is about 1/4 pound at birth and increases in weight to 3 pounds by age 6. Now, not increases in size, thank goodness, or we'd all be walking around with those Martian heads, right? But increases in weight. And the image that we saw previously of all these neurological connections, all of these myelinated synapses taking place in the brain, this is the fibrous connection that results in the weight gain. So if the human brain triples in weight from birth to age 6, does anybody want to take a guess at what might be the weight of an adult brain? 12, somebody said? 1,500 pounds? Oh, grams. Grams, okay. I was like, wow, that's a good guess. Anybody else want to take a guess? 5 pounds, okay. So we have a pretty big range, and I'm not good at my metric conversion, so I'm not sure what 1,500 grams is in pounds. Okay, we got a science guy here. The adult fully developed brain weighs about 3.5 pounds. And so if you really think about that, you think about the fact that 95% of the human brain is developed in the first 6 years of life. It is an incredibly important period of our human development. It is a period of time that presents incredible opportunity, but also represents incredible vulnerability. Because that infant and childhood brain is so dependent on their environment, the quality of that environment is critical to how that brain is going to develop. And what I find really, really interesting and a bit troubling is that 95% of the human brain growth takes place between 0 to 6, but globally, less than 20% of government funding is spent in early childhood healthcare and early childhood education. The experiences young children have with their caregivers impacts the quality of their brain development. And I use the analogy of the house. A strong house doesn't prevent a hurricane. A strong house allows somebody to weather the hurricane with the best potential outcome. And that's what infant mental health is all about. It's not about safeguarding a perfect life for anybody. I wish I had the key to that. It's not about making sure that this child never faces any adversity. It's about making sure that this child has the capacity to cope when life is going to be difficult, because it is difficult at times for all of us. I've got another short video that I think really highlights this perfectly.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
That's from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. Again, another amazing resource of information and videos and information for parents and mental health professionals. So we know that sort of like a strong house, when we first get it built, it might have all the rooms, it might look really lovely, all the structures are in place, but imagine the efficiency or inefficiency of that house if it didn't have any good electrical wiring. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about brain architecture and the development of these connections in early childhood. It's taking that structure of a brain and it's making sure that all the pieces and bits are connected together in a way that allows it to operate efficiently and effectively. And the role of caregiver connections, which is why I'm so excited that a youth mental health symposium allowed me this time to talk about infant and early childhood mental health, is critical. We know that newborns come into this world with a highly impressionable neurological system. They're vulnerable, they're unable to regulate their physical and emotional states on their own. They are completely dependent on the connections with caregivers to help them develop these neurological connections. And I love that graphic of their brain and my brain. And so much of our early interventions and the stuff that the Sunshine Circle stuff is all about that connectedness and the relationships. So responsive relationships, this is the mechanism in which we build healthy brains in young children. And people often say, well, what does that mean, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what a responsive relationship is and what are the sort of the key things that would go into creating a responsive relationship. And although I'm talking about this in the context of early childhood, another really critical period of brain development occurs in adolescence. That last push towards being a fully developed adult brain happens in adolescence and young adulthood. And so the same things that I'm going to talk about are really critical to those things. And I'll reference Mrs. Panton's comments about sometimes when we see behavior in adolescents, getting curious to understand what they're trying to communicate to us. You would have seen in the first video this idea of serve and return. It's like the tennis game, or I should maybe say pickleball nowadays, right? The back and forth of a relationship, and we've all seen that. A baby points and we look and go, oh yeah, it's an airplane. And then the baby babbles and we go, it's very fast. And then the baby babbles some more. This is a serve and return interaction. It seems small, maybe unimportant, maybe I'm busy, but it is the critical relationship that is building those neurological connections, one serve and one return at a time. So what does it look like? It looks like we tune in to our children's cues. They're serving to us. And how do we want to make sure that we're responding to that cue and we're serving back to them, we're returning it. So we want to notice that they've served to us, they've called us, they want to talk to us, they look at us, they coo, they point, they bring us something. Those are all the ways in which children initiate this communication. There's something really, really instinctual in babies that they know that we are important to them, and their babbling and their reaching initially is reflexive, but when we respond with a smile or a snuggle, they learn, hey, this is how I connect to these people around me. We want to think about what this serve might mean. What is it that they're trying to say to us? What is it that they need? When they're babies, we're very patient, right? We try our best to figure out what they need. Are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they uncomfortable? Do they just want to cuddle? When they're teenagers and they're serving us a slam door, we often don't have as much patience, right? And we need to respond in a sensitive way. And what does that mean? And we'll talk a little bit in a bit about what that means to respond in an emotionally attuned or a sensitive way. I think I missed one. It's okay. So what we know is that babies are not born with the ability to regulate their emotions. They need us, and they need those serve and return interactions, those moments of us being attuned to what they need, to be curious about what they're telling us, and to share our attention with them. If they're picking up a rock on the road, to recognize that when they show us that rock and they tell us about it, those pathways in their brains are lighting up. And we might think it's just a rock, but I want you to think back to that image of that MRI and all of that color, all of that connection that took place between 3 months and 10 months. That didn't happen by chance, and it didn't happen by a baby laying in a crib. It happened by a baby talking to its caregivers, cooing, showing, bringing, sharing, and that caregiver responding back to them to build those connections. We know that through these serve and return interactions, these sensitive responses, that children build safety and security, right? It makes them know that, okay, these are my people, they're there for me, they're interested in what I'm interested in, they're gonna respond to me in a way that makes me feel secure, that makes me feel safe. We hear a lot about attachment. When we learned about trauma last year, we heard a lot about attachment as a source leading to traumatic outcomes. And what we know is that how we build that good attachment and make that robust connection is by tuning in being curious, and responding in a sensitive way. Okay, my last video. This one was too cute not to show. Too cute, but also very powerful. This is a replicated study of the still face experiment. Where's my Psych 100 people? Who's heard of the still face experiment? So Ed Tronick was an American psychologist who in the 70s wanted to really understand the relationship between the infant and the child. More importantly, what happened when that relationship was ruptured? What happened when there was a disconnect from this connection that we know is so important to brain development? And he started something called the still face experiment. This particular version is done with dads. In the 70s, there were no dads. It was all done with mothers. But what they found is that there is a universal phenomenon when an infant is disconnected from their caregiver. And it doesn't matter where they've done this study, what cultures they've done this study, what language parents are talking, the results are surprisingly, and I think importantly, always the same.
What we've learned over the years is that babies are much more capable than we initially imagined, but they're also much more vulnerable. And in Ed Tronick's still face experiment, we get to see both in a very short period. We see the baby and the dad playing together in their routines. There are things that they know about each other and things that they do together, and it's fun. And then we ask the dad to turn away, and when he turns back, to keep his face completely still and not respond to the baby. And the results are almost immediate, and they're devastating. The baby looks to the dad and tries to get the dad to get back into those games. Hey, we were just playing just a minute ago, weren't we? We were having fun, what's going on? And then the baby starts to get frustrated when that doesn't work. So she'll have to look away and look around the room and find something else and then look back and say, now can we play? And within 3 minutes, the baby has really dissolved. She is trying to get out of the chair. She's uncomfortable. She's reaching out to dad. She's crying. And then we ask the dad to turn away again. And when he turns back, to go back to being regular dad. And it's a joyous reunion. They get back into their routines, the things that they do together, the things that they were just doing 3 minutes before. And the baby settles down and gets back to the comfort zone that she's developed with the dad. What we see in the still face experiment is how able the child is to initiate and be part of the relationship between the father and the child, but also how much she depends on that relationship in order to keep an even keel. And when she's grounded and comfortable, she can explore the world, she can meet new people,
Hola.
She can try new things, and she's got that safe base that she can always rely on. And there's a trust level there. We can only begin to imagine what it's like for babies whose life is like that 3 minutes all of the time. And they don't get that responsiveness, and they don't get any help getting back to an even keel. And the results can be very tragic. They can have trouble trusting people. They can have trouble relating to people. And they can have trouble being calm enough so that they can explore the world and take part in the world. So we know that those initial relationships, that initial responsiveness and interaction between the father and the baby are keys to the baby's success as a child and as an adult.
And what I think is really important, and sometimes it's really hard to watch that video, right? The beautiful thing that I take away from that is how quickly baby repairs when dad turns back, right? How distressing the disconnection can be, but when that baby is confident that that's my dad, the minute dad returns, that baby can regulate again. We see a very quick, immediately calm baby who can come back into a place of regulation and smile and play and curiosity. And the thing that always strikes me is that the power of connection that caregivers give to their babies is not only just that we have to be attentive 24 hours a day, right? We didn't show this so that we feel this immense guilt the minute we go to the bathroom and we leave our baby crying in the playpen, right? What's amazing is that when we come back to the baby, we can repair and we reestablish that connection again. And it's no different. You drop the baby off at preschool, right? Who's dropped a 4-year-old off at preschool for them to dissolve into tears, down on the ground, crying. We saw that baby, they lose postural control, they lose the ability to regulate their emotions, they become very distressed. And we see that in little ones when we drop them off at school, but we have to go to work. But what matters is when we return and we reestablish that connection and we're attentive and focused and building that secure attachment in that baby that says, hey, I'm coming back. I'm always going to be back here. So there's no danger in the disconnection, only if there is no reconnection. And the still face experiment has actually been redone quite a bit lately with parental cell phone use. And so they know that there's a lot of conversation about how dangerous cell phone use is for young children. But what the field of infant mental health knows is the real danger to young children is parental cell phone use. Because unlike the still face experiment that lasts 3 minutes, sometimes we can be on our phone all evening. And baby might be giving us, or teenager or kid, they're giving us their serves. They're wanting our attention. They're showing us things. They're starting conversations. And we're still face into our phones. My time is up, but I have a quick question. At what age does a child's brain develop the capacity needed to control their own emotions? Shout it out. 4? 25, somebody said. I'm with you. As the mother of a 30 and a 26-year-old, that would be my guess too. Any other guesses? They did a survey, 0 to 3, did a study, and they found that 24% of all parents felt that at 1 year old, a child could regulate their emotions, which means when they were really frustrated, they could and should be able to prevent themselves from having a temper tantrum. 42% of parents felt like this probably wasn't possible at 1, but it was definitely possible by age 2, and that by 2 years old, children should be able to manage their emotions. What we know is it's about 4. It's not until they're 4 can they actually self-regulate themselves. It doesn't mean that children will stop crying. It just means that that's usually what we saw in the still face. It isn't an actual genuine self-regulation. It's a disconnection from their emotional needs. So if children don't have the capacity until they're 4, and we are critical, then how we respond when they're having big emotions makes a very big difference. I'm going to look just quickly at this. There's different ways that we can respond when our children are in distress. I've done all of these, and I'm sure if we're honest, most of us have. When our child is crying and having a tantrum, they're overwhelmed, we get distressed. We start to yell. We get angry. We get upset. We might behave in a punitive way. We want to punish them. We want to spank them. We want to send them away. We might encourage them to express their emotions. We might try to shift the focus of their emotions, give them something that's going to make them happy, give them something that's going to make them excited. We might try to solve the problem for them, right? Our kid is having a hard time. We go in, we want to deal with the problem and fix it for them. Or we want to minimize it and say, why are you making such a big deal out of this? This isn't that big of a deal. And what we know through all the research tells us that emotionally encouraging responses, giving children an opportunity to name the emotion, for us to be curious about what they're experiencing, for us to tune into their serves, do the stuff that Dr. Edwards talked about, name the emotion, label it, be able to identify it and express it. We know that this is what's really healthy. Unfortunately, usually for most of us, this is not how we were raised. And so we have to relearn this. We have to be willing, I think somebody said, to take a critical analysis of ourselves, right? And to be able to recognize that generational, the comment that Ms. Panton made about bridging the gap between maybe how we were parented and how we want to parent today, and being willing to kind of look at the differences. This is an image of a typically developing brain and a brain of a child exposed to severe neglect and trauma. So we know now neurologically the impact. It isn't just that it doesn't feel nice. We actually know from a neurological developmental perspective that it impacts, especially when it happens in those 0 to 6 years, it can really impact brain development. Now, this doesn't happen the one time you lose it and yell at your kid. Thankfully not. This happens repetitively over time if the consistent response that a young child gets is one of disconnection, one of punitive response to their emotional needs. This is the danger. And I love what Quincy said about forgiveness and reconnection. And I tell a story just to close. The very first picture of little baby Shannon is one of me in my mom's arms 53 years ago in a hospital, in a maternity ward. And she's smiling at me with great joy. I have an older brother, so she was probably very happy to have gotten a girl. And she's got, my dad is draped over her shoulder, looking very happy as well. And what she's holding in her right hand is a cigarette. And so my mom didn't smoke during pregnancy, but you bet she lit up the minute I was born. And I don't look at that picture and think, what a terrible mother. I look at that picture and think, that was the information we had at the time. We didn't know how bad smoking was around babies. In Canada, they were smoking in maternity wards in 1970. I have the picture to prove it, right? And so for us to judge, for us to look back and try to blame, there's no healthy outcome in that, right? But what we have to do as a community is we recognize now that what we know now is different. And if what we know now is different, then what we need to do now is different. I'm just mindful of time. I'm gonna just want to play this one last 2-minute video, please. I beg your indulgences. This really, I think, sums it all up in terms of how do we make sure that we're supporting the children in our community for the best possible outcomes.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
Thank you very much.